This meeting is being recorded.
Let's give it till the official 2:05 and then we'll go. How's that?
Oh, you know what? Here comes Bill Warner. I think that means we're good.
All right. Good to go, Eliza?
Yep.
Okay, let's call the meeting to order then. And Eliza, you can do the roll call and we'll take it from there.
Sure. From Chester, we have Pat Bands and Bonnie Bennett. Clinton, Abby Pearsall. Cromwell, I don't think Stewart is here. From Deep River, Daniel Smith. From Essex, Thomas Pinkowish. From Haddam, Bill Warner. I think David Lum said he's joining, but I don't see him yet. From Middlefield, Jim Irish. From Middletown, Marek Kozakowski is joining right now if he's not on yet. Old Lyme, Michael Fogliano. Old Saybrook, Kathy Sugland. Westbrook, Eric Salmon. And that is our committee. From Rivercog, I'm Eliza Lopresti. I also see Megan Juflas, Kevin Armstrong, and Susie Beckman. Sam may be joining. Also, we have Joanne Horrigan from Deep River Housing Authority, Ben Lovejoy from Department of Housing, Bill Neal from Westbrook, and our guest, Dr. Don Poland, who I'll introduce in a moment. And if I forgot anybody, please speak up. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Eliza. And I will turn it over to you for the introduction. But before I do, I'll just note that this will be not the first time that I've had the opportunity and the privilege to hear Don speak. And the first time was when we were working on the regional housing plan, which was, a couple of years ago now? How time flies. And at that time, I recall having been not only enlightened, but having my eyes opened significantly. So, and went back and told my housing commission that they had some homework to go take in the video of that presentation. So I'd encourage everybody to pay close attention because I have no doubt that Don is going to both enlighten us and open our eyes again even further. So with that, Eliza, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So Dr. Don Poland is a spatial and social scientist with over 30 years experience in land use planning, housing, economic development, real estate development, and community investment. Of course, my phone is ringing. Sorry. Having worked in the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors, Dr. Poland offers a unique perspective and deep understanding of the social, spatial, economic, governance, and policy challenges that face communities and real estate developers. Internationally trained, Dr. Poland earned his PhD from University College London. His doctoral research focused on urban ecology, ecological resilience, and how ecological metaphors and theory help us understand urban environments as complex adaptive systems. This has allowed him to develop a unique approach to planning and urban policy that treats cities and markets as complex adaptive systems to be managed through strategic interventions and governance. Dr. Poland is accepted as an expert witness in the areas of land use planning, neighborhood redevelopment, and community development in U.S. courts in Louisiana and Missouri, and is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. His academic experience includes an appointment as visiting lecturer in urban studies, graduate studies program at Trinity College, an associate professor, instructor, and adjunct lecturer in geography, planning, and tourism at CCSU, UConn, and Manchester Community College. And as Michael mentioned, he has also worked closely with Megan and the Rivercog team to create our award-winning regional housing plan. So Don, thank you for your generosity in being with us and talking to our committee today.
Thank you. Thanks to both you and Michael for the very kind introductions. kind of chuckling to myself on the complex adaptive systems because I realized that, the second line of my first slide is actually going to say exactly that. Hopefully you see my full screen version here. And today I'm going to talk about housing market dynamics. This is a bit more of a high altitude look than probably the presentations I gave related to the housing plan for the COG, but I am drawing on some of the information from that to make some points and so forth. So first, general introduction. Aim of this presentation is to provide an understanding of housing markets and the River COG housing market. Probably the most important point I want to make is housing markets are complex adaptive systems that are influenced by and organized around multiple variables. And I'll be speaking about a lot of those variables. One of my frustrations often is that the media, we as individuals, we typically talk about the housing market as being singular. Just as I said, the housing market. And, you'll see studies or reports about Connecticut's housing market. And the fact is there's not a singular housing market. There's actually a multiplicity of housing markets. And just for example here, the market's organized around scale, locations, and product. So you have a home buyer's market versus a renter's market. You have a detached housing versus attached housing. You have occupied, full-time structures versus seasonal structures. You have an urban market versus a suburban market versus a rural market. And I could go on and on and on and carve it up in all these different ways, but I just want to make the point that there's multiple markets at play. The other thing is consumers of housing or consumer preferences are constantly shifting and changing, impacting the relationship between supply, demand, and location. And demographics and demographic structure are key to understanding housing markets. And I'll kind of come back to many of these points as we go through this to kind of talk about some of the nuance. The first thing I want to touch on is spatial organization of housing markets. And at the end of the day, housing is organized around employment. It's the symbiotic relationship between place of work and place at home that kind of define the housing market at a large regional scale. So in this context, places that are closer to job centers, typically the urban core, but now we have, a multiplicity of centers of locations of employment. But places with better accessibility to employment tend to have higher values. So as you move further from the core, you tend to see values decline. As you move closer to the core, you see values increase. There's also a relationship here related to density and distance of the core. Higher density tends to be closer to the urban core, less density further from. There are anomalies along the way. And then income ultimately impacts consumption, both floor area and land area. Higher income, larger square foot of floor area. Higher income, larger, minimum lot sizes. A key defining factor here in the context of the larger metropolitan scale region is ultimately commute times, that we can kind of define housing markets better by time than we can by distance. The average US commuter commutes 28 minutes. The average in Connecticut is 26. The fact that it's lower actually makes sense. We're a smaller, more compact state. So in some ways that's not surprising. But what is interesting is only 23% of commuters commute over 34 minutes. So when you think about the national average is 28, that then only 23% are more than 34 minutes. It shows you how short overall commute times are and kind of how compact regions can be. And only 7% of commuters commute over 1 hour. In Connecticut, that's 8%. Connecticut's probably 1 percentage point higher due to Fairfield County and the New York City market, that people are making those longer commutes more commonly in that area. So the primary market organizes at the metropolitan scale with multiple submarkets. It's a direct relationship between place of home and place of work that organizes these places. The organization is more temporal based on time and commute time, and demand and values are greatest near the core and least near the periphery. An example here that we used in the housing study for the River Cog was based on a 2,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2.5 bathroom, 2-car garage, contemporary Cape. And I did an analysis of comparable properties across various geographies in the Hartford region. And essentially what you see here is the per square foot value of a comparable property is highest near the core and decreases as you move out to the periphery. And in most cases, that will most likely play out. These are two sets of data. I'm going to focus your attention to the right-hand side first. This was part of the regional housing study we did in the COG, and it was a mapping of major employers, large employers, 250 plus in red and 1,000 plus employees in blue. We wanted to see where the large employers, kind of indicating where the employment centers were within the region. We were comparing that to the fair market areas for housing. And then we did, recognizing that the overwhelming majority of large employers are clustered towards the north end of the region in Middletown. We then mapped, we identified 3 locations: Middlesex Corporate Center, Pratt & Whitney, and Middlesex Hospital. We dropped a geofence on them, which captures cell phone data, and then queried for the likely location of home. So all the dots you see on these 3 maps are where the employees at those locations most likely reside. And what you can see is kind of this clustering in close, but then this vast spread of jobs, and especially within your region as a whole, the majority of the where employers are coming from is to the north end of the region. And that's kind of the impact of the larger Hartford market. And you see very lesser or very little interaction with the south end of the marketplace. So we ultimately then broke up the regions into 3 typologies, kind of the northern market, the middle market, and the shore market. I provide some key points here, some key demographics that were taken from the housing plan, just to make some points. And some of this is intuitive, we'd expect it. The largest population in the north, the lowest in the interior, which is probably the most rural, and then the shoreline. Households coincide with that. Median ages run lowest in the north, run highest in the south. I'm going to come back to that on a later slide. You can see average household sizes, median household incomes, lowest in the north, highest in the middle, second highest in the south, and then median home values. I'm going to come back to this a bit later, but the highest being in the coastal, and then the average age of housing. So that's kind of a look at kind of housing market, spatial organization, and structure. I now want to talk a bit about demographics, because ultimately demographics tell us so much about what's going on in a housing market. It can really help us kind of identify and see shifts and changes. So I first want to give a brief overview of what's called the demographic transition model. It's a metric that allows us to kind of explain and understand how populations grow, coinciding with population pyramids as shown at the bottom. So stage 1 is called typically called stability, and you have a high birth rate, high death rate, so the population doesn't really grow. Lots of children are born, lots of people die at younger ages, not reaching retirement age, and therefore you have a stable population. If you looked at a country like Somalia today, it would follow the stage 1 profile. Stage 2 in the model, you start seeing a decrease in death rate. This is improvement in medical care, antibiotics, pesticides, so forth and so on, that bring the death rate down. Birth rate remains very high, and you see population growth or natural increase greatly. And this is where the proverbial pyramid comes into play, and why these are called age pyramids or population pyramids. Then as the birth rate starts to slow in stage 3, you start seeing a siloing effect on the bottom of the pyramid here. Birth rates, death rates still coming down. And then when you hit stage 4, you see this low birth rate, low death rate, and you see this true silo. And that's really where Connecticut is today, 2020. And that's where you would find most of the post-industrialized Western world, Europe, the US, Japan, Australia, and so forth. And then some do claim there's a stage 5. I struggle with it. The original transition model ended at stage 4, and I think stage 5 can take on a lot of various looks. So, but here it assumes that the birth rate comes back up, and we really haven't experienced that much in many places. So I'm a bit suspect of it. I want to point you to the top pyramid here, which is Connecticut in the year 2000. If we're of a certain age, which I am, you remember back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of media attention and planning attention on our loss of 20-something-year-olds. We couldn't retain and attract 20-something-year-olds. They'd go off to college and not return and so forth. You could say we've solved that problem with this siloing effect, right? And you can still see that missing population up here in the 40 to 60 cohort versus the 20 to 40 cohort up here, right? So you see, which was my generation, Generation X, moving up the pyramid, and you see this siloing effect that we're not showing a loss anymore of that population. It'd be easy to say that that's a good thing. I'm not necessarily sure it is demographically, and I'll come back to that in other ways. The key statistic that we talk about birth rates, but the more accurate way to measure births is the fertility rate. It's the likely number of children that a woman of childbearing years will have over the course of her life. And it's the total fertility rate, this one here, showing the US average at 1.73 in 2018. If you go back here, in 2008, it was 2.08. In 2020, it's 1.64. I have Connecticut above, and you can see our fertility rate is actually lower, 1.51. And that's continuing on, and most likely will continue to tick down. There was a little baby boom right after COVID, probably people avoiding hospitals in 2020, so a little pent-up demand for childbirth. But then coming right back down again. So anticipated that fertility rates are going to continue to tick down moving forward. This is important, and once again, I'll come back to these numbers. What's important about that fertility rate is in order to replace a population, you need a fertility rate of between 2.1 and 2.3. So this line is replacement, running at about 2.2 or 2.1. You can see generationally and over decades, historically, we used to produce a lot of children. And then you start to hit the 70s and our fertility rates just plummeted. They bump back up a little bit in the early 90s, they stay up, and now they're on this downward trajectory again. We are having fewer children than we ever previously had before. And that ultimately will arrive us at a place of a different type of population pyramid, and it has some challenges with it. So this is a projection or showing US population growth from 1950 up to 2010, and then a projection out to 2050. On the projection side, over 65 population more than doubles. That's the baby boomers. That's that large cohort of population moving up through and living longer than they ever have before. Then we see the 15 to 64 population in here only increased by 16%. And we see the under 15 increase by 70%. I want to note, though, as a percentage of total, if we look kind of here, and then we look here, even though there's a 17% increase in young persons, 15, less than 15, the fact is, as a percent of total, they're becoming a smaller and smaller cohort. And that's directly related to that declining fertility rate. I promise you, this is all about housing. Some demographic change. Parents with children under the age of 18 living at home declined by 3 million over the past decade, from 66 million to 63.1 million between 2010 and 2020. There are 36.2 million single person households, making up 28% of total households. Fact is, in 1940, only 8% of households were single person. In 1960, only 13%. And today, it's 28%. In 2020, only 33% of adults over the age of 15 had never married, or 33% of adults over the age of 15 had never married, and that's up from 23% in 1950. I didn't choose 15 years old for marriage, it's just a demographic break. But it shows a significant decline in marriage over this period of time. Median age to marry has also been increasing, which is shown in the next bullet. And more than half, 58% of adults age 18 to 24 live in their parents' home, up from 55% in 2019. This is a generational shift that we're seeing. And you can see here reflected in these numbers in this graphic from 1970 to 2012. Single person households go from 17% to 7.4. Two-person households also increase by about 5 percentage points. And then the 3, 4, and 5-person households all contract. This is our shrinking household size, which then leads us to this next slide. If we go over here, this is my favorite graphic. Had to do it a bit smaller to fit the table, though. But in 1970, 40% of households were married couples with children. Today, well, in 2012, it was 19.6. Today, it is 19%. Half of that cohort of married couples with children have gone away. Married couples without children statistically has stayed constant. And it's the other kind of family and non-family households, but most importantly, it's the single women and single men, the single person household that's increased the most. So I said 28% of households nationally are single person. It's 30% in Connecticut. And when you look at owner occupied, 22.2, but look at the renter occupied housing. 45% of renter occupied units are single person. I'll foreshadow into school-age children a little bit. Think about that. On the renter side, 40% of housing units would be producing no school-age children because they're single person. And then another 27% are two-person households. More likely to be two adults than an adult with a child, but not to say there isn't adults with children in that cohort. If you want to know what produces school-age children, owner-occupied households, 4 or more persons, you know, that's where your largest school-age children are most likely coming from. So I'll pick on Middlefield because I recently did some detailed analysis there. And this is Middlefield's age pyramid in 2023. Look at that contraction, that contraction between 20 years old and 45 years old. That is your population that would be producing children, but it's almost non-existent. So, you know, it's so much smaller than the baby Gen X and baby boomers above, and so forth. So then you see a contraction. If this cohort is producing children, then you see a contraction at the base that's below, you know, what was previously coming through as young persons. You see a contraction in young persons. This is the projection out to 2028. And I would just say it's kind of an inverted pyramid now. It's widest near the top, less the oldest people dying off, right? And it contracts all the way down. I'm going to come back and do another example of this after this slide. So this was from our regional housing market study for the COG. And when we looked at population change between 2010 and 2020 for under 18, so that's 0 to 17 years old, Connecticut lost, Harford County lost, Middlesex County lost, New London County lost, and all of the West Cog communities lost young persons, that under 18 population. We compared that also to school enrollments, and the fact is every community lost enrollments also during that period. Makes sense. You lose young people, you're going to lose enrollments. So aging population results in a loss of young persons, young families, and school-aged children. Since 2008, RiverCog has lost 21.4%, or 5,000 public school enrollments, confirming the 19.4% loss in population under 18. Middlefield and Durham, which is Regional School District 13, lost 33.2%, or 791 enrollments since 2008. Look at Westbrook. Their median age is the highest in the region at 55, and they've lost 40% of their school enrollments since 2008. Now let's come back. I'm kind of using Middlefield here as a metaphor for the community, for the region as a whole. Maybe a bit of a more worse case, but I still think it's important. Look back now at 2010. Look at that loss, that failure to retain and attract a 20-something-year-old population, essentially, the population that would give birth to children. This outright explains why, and I'm sure if I looked at the pyramid for Durham, it would be similar, why Region 13 lost almost 800 students, or 36.7% of its enrollments between 2008 and 2023. There was no one there to produce children, right? And we see the numbers up here from the population change in the table above compared to 23. There's still a hefty contraction here, but not as bad as it was back then. So, having a grasp on some of this demographic information now, let's look at housing supply and demand in various ways. First, housing as a commodity is kind of different. Think about it in the context of your automobile. Your automobile can move around, and whether you own your car in Durham or over here where I am in Cheshire, your car is probably worth the same thing. You know, marginal difference in sales value depending on where you sell it. But your house is fixed in location. You can't move it. It's non-movable. Yes, occasionally a house gets moved, but that's not the norm. So your house's value is tied to local variables because it's fixed in place. It's also durable and long lasting. That rotary dial phone that you had in the 1970s and 80s, most likely you no longer have. And if you do, get rid of it, please. But at the end of the day, the prior products go away. You know, our phones get replaced every 3 or 4 years, right? But with housing, it remains on the landscape. It's not a bad thing, but this house from 300 years ago, 250 years ago, is still in the housing market competing with this very recent house, competing with this mid-century house. That durability means the product stays for a long time. But housing is also temporal. It's constructed at specific moments in time to meet consumer demands. You know, I grew up in a 1956 built 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, 1-car garage, 1,000 square foot on a 1/4-acre lot. And that was the middle class kind of norm of 1956. And that's what my parents could afford in 1971. That product is still there today, but today the average house being built in the market is 2,600 square feet, and it's 2.5 bathrooms. It's 3+ bedrooms. It's a 2-car garage and it's a 1-acre lot. That's a much different product than what my parents purchased in 1971. But when you think about that, how does declining household size, an aging population, increase in 1- and 2-person households, and fewer children impact consumer preferences for housing products? This used to be the desirable, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong screen here, but this used to be the desirable norm for families. It was kind of the hottest product, say 15 years ago in the housing market, just, 2006 or whatever. But if now only 20% of households, less than 20, 19% are married couples with children, demand for this is actually waning. That rising single person household doesn't necessarily want or need this. So you can see how the market shifts as demographics change. Creative destruction, innovation, new methods, materials, technologies, and techniques destroy that which came before it. Older housing is often at a competitive disadvantage. This house struggles in today's market compared to a new, more modern product. It could be undersized closets, the lack of the ensuite bathroom in the master, and so forth. Those little amenities become ultimately deficiencies. So all housing and locations can become functionally obsolete, unable to compete with newer products and locations. And the same is true of commercial real estate. So the key demographics that kind of drive markets, and especially the housing market, are jobs, population, household formations, and income. If jobs are growing, typically population's growing. If population's growing, typically household formations are growing. If all those things are growing, then you're going to have high demand. In Connecticut, as I'll talk to on other slides, we've kind of had stagnant job growth. From 1990 on to now, our peak level of employment have not changed. We dip every time there's a recession, we bounce back up, we dip, we bounce back up, but we haven't really seen meaningful job growth. Our population's also been pretty anemic. It's really household formations, that increase in 1- and 2-person households, that's creating the most growth in the market. But when we look at your marketplace in your region, the Hartford Northern, very anemic on population. The Southern Middlesex, kind of the middle region there, seeing the best growth in population and household. And then look at the coast, looking at Lyme and Old Lyme. Look at that contraction. Not even household formations are growing. They're contracting, which really kind of points to this kind of demographic and market contraction. You can see here, just what I'm talking about, demand drivers, jobs, and population. From 1985 to 1990, Connecticut added 103,000 jobs. Over the next 30 years, from 1990 to 2020, we only added 45,000 jobs. That's kind of a wow number. What happens to demand? Well, and then look at our population growth, 1950s, 17%, 60s, 26%, 70s, 19%, then 2.5, 5.8, all these low numbers, most recent, 0.9. Look at the graph on the right-hand side. When jobs are growing and population is growing, we build a lot of housing. Yes, you can see economic downturns, right? But in general, building a lot of housing. Then you hit the late 80s, the early 90s recession, and we drop and we plateau. We have a little bounce back into the early 2000s, and then we drop again and we plateau. Our housing construction parallels kind of job growth and population growth. But you do see something a little bit interesting here, is the share of multifamily, the green on top, becomes a much larger share since 2012 than it was back here. Very little multifamily being built. The fact is, the majority of our multifamily product that's out there today is more than 30 years old. It's pre-1990. Look at, we used to build a lot of it back here, very little through here, and then it's creeping back up. This table here just shows it a few extra years that it's continuing as a larger market share, up in the 40% of total market for new housing permits is multifamily. But my point here is multifamily housing is not a choice. You know, we get so many communities get worked up over it. And, you know, finish these comments or think of them however you may, but, you know, you may hear people saying multifamily is too dense, or we don't want renters, or we must protect and preserve the character of our community. We must zone out multifamily. I could go on and on with various phrases I've heard at public hearings. But the fact is, this isn't about multifamily, really. This is about demographics. The fact is, we are aging. We are marrying later, we are marrying less, and we're having fewer children than we ever have before. And the 1 and 2 person households are growing the fastest. Once again, down to here. And the fact is, the 1 and 2 person household doesn't want that 2,600 square foot, 4-bedroom, 2.5 bathroom, 2-car garage on a 3-acre lot house. That's not to say that that product is obsolete or it's going away. Single family, detached multifamily will remain the predominant housing product. But its market share is less than it's ever been before, or at least in the modern era, right? So these forces that we're up against from a planning perspective, from a community perspective, are actually forces of demographics, which we really can't stop. The founder of Demographic America, which was a trade magazine, a guy by the name of Peter Francis, was famous for always saying demographics are destiny. When we look at those population pyramids and stuff, they're projecting a future. I don't go as far as destiny, because things can change, but they don't change quickly. They don't change without effort. And therefore, they are projecting a future. And the future of the housing market in Connecticut is going to remain here, being kind of a split market between multifamily and single family. It's not going back to here, where the multifamily share was only 6% of the total marketplace. So, markets are not always rational. These are taken from CHFA, their recent report, and I love them. But look at this, for sales and inventory by month in metro area. So you see Hartford, Stamford, New Haven, New London, Torrington. And this is the inventory of for sale going back to 2018. And it's continually contracted down. But then jump over here. This is 1 to 4 unit home sales in Connecticut by year. Look at this. Other than this anomaly of 2021, demand has stayed constant. Actual closings have stayed constant. We close the same number of houses every year, even though the supply has been cut by 1/3. So listing products for sales have declined substantially, yet sales remain constant, even with increased interest rates. Demand has not increased, supply has contracted. So you'll hear comments about, you know, the strong housing market and the great demand. No, the housing market's no different today as far as demand goes pre-COVID as post-COVID in Connecticut, even nationally too. What's changed is the supply. People are moving less. They're staying in those houses longer. And that was actually a trend that started before COVID and has maybe been exaggerated with COVID. Home buyers and interest rates. Once again, consumers are not rational. consumers tend to claim that interest rates are high, a part of a larger narrative that the economy is poor. Well, here's your historic interest rates. Here we are today. They're not high. Maybe this was exceptionally low. Maybe this is the anomaly, right? And this is a return ultimately to the norm. Still much lower than historic. And I'm sure many of you remember, and I know I have friends and relatives who got mortgages back in the 80s at 14%. Well, 6.8% sounds pretty good compared to that, doesn't it? So my point is with this, I'm not saying that, it's unfounded for us to be concerned about higher interest rates. What I'm saying is we need to maintain kind of a rational perspective in this historical context of what's going on in the marketplace. So housing and financial feasibility. Often in planning circles, this isn't talked about a lot, and I wanted to touch on this because we just completed a large study for WestCog, the Fairfield County reciprocal to RiverCog. And we were asked the question of how can WestCog efficiently provide more affordable housing, which was really a question of finance. From a cost-effective way, how can we provide more affordable housing? So we did a financial feasibility study across the entire marketplace to try and figure out what was the most economical way to produce affordable housing. And I could caveat that is it wasn't just about affordable housing, it was any housing that was captured in the study with a focus on affordability. So return on investment, that's ultimately what investors look at. What is the potential for return? So projects must achieve returns and attract investors, whether it be debt equity from institutions like banks, or whether it be debt capital, or whether it be equity capital from individual investors. If they can't attract those investments, and development doesn't get built. So typical returns are 12 to 18%. We've seen them inching in some cases to 15 to 20%. There's often this perspective in planning and so forth of like, oh my God, these are just greedy developers. I'll get to that on the next slide. They're not. It's the only way to attract investment. And let me just make a clear point. For an investor, it doesn't matter if I'm sitting here in Connecticut. If I had $1 million to invest, I don't have to invest in housing in Connecticut. I can invest in Austin, Texas, where I can guarantee myself probably an 18 or 20% return. So capital can go anywhere. So the investment market's competitive spatially and geographically. So typical returns on investment reflect risk and vary by the conditions of the market, growth and affluence, urban versus suburban. This is just a look at capital markets, 30-year returns on emerging market stocks, 8.7%, I think that says. Real estate investment through the stock market into the REITs and stuff, 7.3. Compared to a development here, has to return 12 to 18%, development costs $250 per square foot, market rents in this range, operating expenses capture more than a third of market rents, debt probably captures another 50 to 60%, and then leaving very little, 7.33% is a return on investment. That development of those housing units will not occur. Because why? Because you can put your money elsewhere. You can drop your $1 million in the US bonds and guarantee yourself 4% with little to no risk. It's the high risk nature. And part of that risk is the land use approval process. Spend $250,000 to get before a planning and zoning commission and then have them deny you. You're out 250 grand, right? it takes you a year to get through the land use approval process, do the litigation, or maybe it takes you 2 years. And then it's a 2-year construction build, and the economy goes from strong to recession. And all of a sudden you end up with a half-built development and the developer's gone bankrupt. There's so many risks here that the returns have to be higher. So this is just a look at some data. Going back to, these are some analysis we have done in recent times, but that talk of a singular housing market, people will talk about the Hartford housing market. Well, here you have 3 suburban communities surrounding Hartford. And look at the difference in the multifamily market. Look at the rents, 1,600 versus 1,400 versus 1,100. 1,750 versus 1,600 versus, 1,400. They're not a singular marketplace. Each one of these communities is their own marketplace. New construction on average, units running about this size, cost per square foot for construction. What's the likelihood of new multifamily construction being built in East Hartford here? Well, market rents are running well below the cost of construction. Weathersfield's probably middling. You can maybe make it work. West Hartford. So you can start seeing where is investment most likely to flow based on market conditions versus cost of construction. And that's kind of, so this multiplicity of marketplaces, and then this comparison between what is the market commanding or returning versus what are the costs of construction on the front end. So this comes from the Westcog finance study. We looked at different asset classes across different typologies that we created. We assumed government assistance in the form of land donations or tax abatements or other programs like CHFA or low-income housing tax credits. We made financial assistance assumptions, and then we ran comparative developments. So this one here, single family rural, no financial assistance, 5 units at market rate. So these are 5 single-family house subdivision, basically. Look at the returns on investment on project and equity IRR. We'll just look at equity. 25% return. You wonder why developers like building single-family homes and would build them all day? Because they're a very stable and safe kind of bet if there's market demand for them. But then you add 2 affordable units, right? 80% at 80% AMI to this development, and look what happens to the equity IRR. It goes to 1.3. That development's not financially feasible. You can't provide that level of affordable housing in that development. It just doesn't work. But then what if we did a cluster subdivision with density bonuses, right? Same 5 acres of land, but now we allow 24 units, 17 market rate, 7 at 80% AMI, and look at this. Now your equity return is actually at 26.8. We did this across other things. Office to apartment conversion, interestingly, if you're not dealing with a brownfield site, can actually in some cases be very financially feasible at 19%. The most feasible, one of the most interesting and least expensive, converting large single-family homes into quadplexes works out really well. So you take a 8,000 square foot house, cut it up into 4 2,000 square foot units, and that's actually very financially feasible. Another thing we looked at, this was interesting. We made this assumption. It's actually an assumption I've had for a long time. If the majority of our multifamily housing product is 30 years or more in age, going back pre-1990, then there's probably a fair amount, especially when you're talking 1970s, 40 years, 1960s, 50 plus years. There's a fair amount of older multifamily product out there that is actually kind of limping along. It performs, it's occupied, its rents are relatively cheap, but the owners are probably cash poor. They're not earning a lot off of them, and they're probably open to a cash infusion. So we wanted to look at what's the comparative cost between building a new unit of housing for affordability or deed restricting an existing unit in an older apartment complex as affordable. So we did some calculations to figure out market valuation. So one bedroom, 281,000 in market value, depreciate it, for the 80% AMI, the loss in rent, right? And to purchase the deed restriction for 40 years is probably $52,000. Did it over here with state MRI, state median income. But the difference between new construction, that's the big point here, $170,000 to build this one bedroom apartment versus $54,000 to deed restrict it. The benefit to the owner of the development is they get $50,000 in cash for each of the units that gets deed restricted. It gives them a cash infusion, hopefully structured in such a deal that's reinvested back into the units, renovations and upgrades. The point is we're trying to find other ways of thinking about housing affordability and how to provide affordable housing. So then, multifamily housing development. This was development I worked on that was actually within your region. It was a part of a mixed use development. It's not an active application right now. But this was the housing component of it. And it had a 10% affordable at 80% AMI. It would lose at those numbers, 10% affordable, 80% AMI, it loses $306,000 a year in gross income, 4% of gross and 7% of net income. If it was 20% affordable units at 80, it would lose 600,000, and 30% it would lose 900,000. My point in this, in showing this calculation, is the challenge. From a policy perspective, we've decided affordable housing is important. We've also provided developers with a workaround, right, to circumvent zoning to provide it. We've given them a carrot. But we've also, in doing that, we've shifted the responsibility of paying for it to the private sector. The developer is the one that eats this money per year unless they have some other state funding to actually augment it, like low-income tax credits or home program or whatever. My point is just showing kind of there's a huge burden on them to actually provide it. And when you get to the 60% AMI, you can almost double these numbers. So think about it this way. What if I said, you know, we're going to take 7% of your net income and give it to other people for affordable housing? What happens to your home finances if 7% of your net goes away? You probably don't crash and burn, but life becomes a little more challenging at a 7% loss. Just as a hypothetical to make that point. The last thing I want to touch on because of your region is seasonal and short-term rentals. And this was covered in the regional plan. These do have an impact on market, but I think there's some interesting things here to pay attention to. One is there's probably seasonal rentals in all of your communities or most of your communities, but they're most prevalent along the coast. No surprise to anyone, right? But look at how substantial they can be. In Old Lyme, 26% of the housing stock is actually seasonal. That's huge. You know, 21% in Westbrook, 18% in Saybrook. Those are really big numbers. And so the impact on what I call destination dwellings, it creates competition for the conventional housing market. It constrains supply, and it drives up demand and value. Look at down here. You have a weaker in the shoreline. You have a weaker median household income than in the interior market, but you have a housing home value that's actually higher. And that's the coastal effect. That's the seasonal effect. The coastal communities are much more desirable. People from outside them are willing to pay a premium to access them. Also, if you remember, I pointed out the median age in the coastal communities was higher than the two other regions. And I would assume in that it's the fact that someone's second home, their summer vacational seasonal home, likely becomes a retirement home later on, and that's probably driving up the median age of population. And it's also part of what's probably, if we're talking about earned income, driving down the median household income also within that marketplace. So just some concluding thoughts that I want to put out there, and welcome to take some questions if you have them. Housing markets are dynamic and complex, no singular housing market. Location, proximity, and accessibility to employment matters. Demographics drive markets. Demographics and markets don't pay attention to community plans, the desires and wants of community. It's this real struggle I have when I'm doing a plan. Let's vision and see what we want in the future. And everyone tells us their ideals. I was doing economic development work out in the northwest corner of Connecticut. And I had a small little town with like 1,800 people tell me they wanted a Nordstrom's. That was their desire. They wanted a Nordstrom's. That's great. We can keep that, we can talk about that in the plan if you want us to, but Nordstrom's isn't coming there. It's never going to happen. Yes, you have the income for it, but you don't have the population and household density for it. So my point is, markets and demographics don't pay attention to those kind of wants and desires of a community. So we have to be careful that we try and temper or be rational in our wants and desires. The housing market is constantly shifting and changing. What was a desirable product or location yesterday may no longer be desirable today or tomorrow. We constantly see that. 1950s, what was the peak location of retail? Downtown, Main Street. 1970s, what was the peak location? The regional mall, 7 miles outside of the city center, right? And now what's happened? Downtown retail's gone. The regional malls are failing. These things are constantly shifting and changing. It's the same for housing also. Communities, regions, and states need to embrace and not resist change. It gets back to that you can't stop demographics. It's where we're heading. The market's adapting to it. And there's greater demand now for multifamily than there ever was before. I know it's a change. I know it's hard to adjust to, but you got to figure out ways. Stop resisting school-age children and young families. I typoed there. We would not prohibit children from the 4th of July parade, while we would prohibit them from your schools. My point here is children and families are part of community, and it gets really frustrating regardless of which side of the table I'm on, working for the commission doing a plan or working for a developer. It gets really frustrating when I'm confronted with communities that are anti-children. And that's coming from a guy that doesn't have children. At the end of the day, it's part of our community. It's the future of our community. It's what Little League and PTO and bake sales and all those things, 4th of July parades, all those things orientate around. It's part of community, and we need to find a way to embrace it again. And housing is economic development. Housing is where jobs go at night. You can't disconnect the two. That symbiotic relationship of place of home, place of work. Housing is interconnected to the work of economic development. If you can't provide housing for the workers, and that means a diversity of housing types for the working population, then you're not going to succeed at economic development. So with that, I will stop. And thank you guys for listening to me.
I can start with a question if you want to get the ball rolling, Don.
Sure.
Going back to a couple of your slides, looking at the effect on return on investment, is it a fair thought to that definitely the scale and probably the nature of public incentives for affordable housing is going to be required? Some new thinking on that?
Yeah, that was a key objective within our work with WestCog. If I go back to this table, you can kind of see uh, that we were constantly testing incentives. And this is the whole thing. Now, WestCog's a bit unique. You know, you have a really uh, much higher value housing market down there. Land values typically are more than 50% of a single family residential property and so forth. So a bit of a different creature than most of Connecticut. But when I was showing, for example, this, and I made reference to Weathersfield, I've done two deals in Weathersfield, two developments where I helped the developers get their approvals, and it was both land use approvals and abatement approvals from the council. The fact is, the developments penciled out to like 9% returns, but we really needed to get to that 12% in order for it to move forward, and therefore tax abatements were structured to help it. And I'm not one to say we have to be giving away money, you know, to developers and granting tax abatements. But my example is one of the developments was pretty simple and straightforward. It didn't need a lot of assistance, and it got 2 years at 100%, first 2 years. That's it. The other development got a 10-year deal that was 100% for the first 3 years, and then stepping down to 20% in year 10. So my point being is the incentives were structured to make the deals happen. And the second deal was more complex because it involved the demolition of an existing industrial structure with site remediation, and it was just more costly. But yeah, government incentives in the form of abatements, in the form of land donations. You know, if you have an old school that you have no purpose for it or whatever, you know, consideration of donating the property for affordable housing. There's many different things that can be done, but it has to be part of it.
Thank you. And thanks for another, as I said, enlightening and eye-opening presentation for us. Appreciate it very much.
You're welcome.
I had a question. It's kind of almost with what you had talked about with those two examples.
Sure.
In our area, you know, we're trying to look at conversion of either small, what used to be, you know, old drugstore buildings into 1 or 2 units. It seems like that really still doesn't fly until you get to 4 units in terms of for the developers to get really interested. But the other category is the large industrial building. I know Deep River was successful in converting something right on their main street, and a lot of units, huge, you know, and that went well. And we're in the next town over. We're, you know, I'd say almost every town in Connecticut has a large industrial building somewhere that went south or is abandoned. So two things. Number one, how does that change? But your example in Weathersfield kind of spoke a little bit to that, where they had to go 10 years out for benefits. But you know, isn't that more of like a state problem? If every city in Connecticut or town in Connecticut has that industrial and you need that huge remediation, is it any grounds for the state saying, all right, here's a bunch of money, and if you're using it to convert warehouses, this will help the towns get out, apply for it, and we distribute it?
Yeah, so the Weathersfield example actually had $4 million from DECD on top of the tax abatements to help with the remediation. The point being is sometimes the remediation can just be so costly that it makes it really, really challenging. So
At least now you have something back in play. And then in 20 years, we don't need people anymore in those buildings. You know, that, like to your point, demand's changed. Now it's a usable property again, where now it's just a drain.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the real long-term piece of it.
I've been involved in about 24 tax abatement deals over the past 7 years. And I've sat on both sides of the table. I've represented municipalities, I've represented developers, and I've actually been hired as a third party kind of, make sure that everyone's on the up and up with the cards they're showing. So I've played all roles in them. And oh shoot, I just lost what I was saying. Uh in what did you say? I'm sorry, I just lost my thought.
We're
The
talking about
last thing is,
how important, how big tax abatement is.
oh right. In all of those deals, regardless of what side I was on, or my firm was on, they were all structured to make sure the municipality remained whole. That is, you maintain receiving the amount of taxes you're receiving on that property today, uh, through those years of 100% abatement. So you never go backwards. So the money you're playing with that's captured in the abatement is future dollars that you don't have right now. And you kind of implied that, the property is just producing whatever its functional obsolescence value is. And those future dollars aren't there. So no one's losing those dollars. You may not fully realize them over 4, 5, 10 years, but at some point you reach that year 7 or that year 11 or whatever it is, and you do fully realize those dollars, which you otherwise wouldn't have. So it's not like we're giving away money, that we've taken in money and then we're writing a check back. We're just using that future value to make the development more financially feasible.
Thank you. Yeah. What about any tips for, making the old, small, not so small, 25, 3,000 square foot mixed use property in the past into 2 units and making that, or maybe 3, to make it feasible? Because on the slide you have here, you have single family to duplex and triplex, and there's not much there.
Yeah,
4 and 6.
if you just be clear on that one, in none of those single family, the duplex or quadplex, were we assuming government assistance. So there were no tax abatements, there were no land donations, there was nothing. These were just market numbers. Seeing a 6.2 here on the triplex, small tax abatement, maybe, 100% down to 20% over 5 years, could probably pull that into play. Also, the developer you're looking at, who would probably be doing such conversions of singles to duplexes and triplexes and so forth, is probably the small local guy and is probably
Yeah.
more apt to be able to cash fund it. So my point being, the point to answer your question, you're right. Things can be really tough when it's just one additional unit. The more units that come in play, typically the numbers get a little bit better. And you see that here, you go from 3.5 to 6.2 to then, wow, look at that, 24%. The numbers shift quickly. So if you can get those extra units in, it'll make it much easier.
Thank you.
I think you're muted, Bill.
You see any more hands up, Eliza?
No, there we go. I had 2 mutes on. So other than Deep River, Chester, and Middletown, everything in the River Cog, those are the only places that have sewers, and really septic didn't come up, and obviously density helps ROI, and septic goes against density. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I was involved in a development, controversial affordable housing development. But part of the strategy, it was the conversion of a large, approximately 6,000 square foot single family property. It was going to be demolished and rebuilt with, I believe it was 8 2-bedroom apartments. And the interesting thing I learned in that development, I'm not an expert on the public health code, But the way the health code reads is you can have up to 16 bathrooms or no, 16 bedrooms on a septic system without it being considered a community septic. So 16 one bedrooms or 8 two bedrooms can actually work through the health code. So my point being is that provides a lens for maybe thinking about small scale multifamily conversions and potential affordability. Won't work everywhere, soils are going to matter and, so forth and so on. But I wouldn't just say we don't have public sewer, therefore alternative housing styles are out. We can only do, 3-acre single family detached. I think if you open your eyes a little bit and get a bit creative, you can find ways around. So.
We did have a developer that does large units, and I think their kind of general break even on operating a rental place was up in the like 20 to 40 minimum units.
Yeah.
So that gets back to kind of the small local developer owning a few apartments.
Yep, it can be challenging. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, a lot of times, we'll help developers with their pro formas and, building out, their financial feasibility, nothing to do with land use approvals or whatever. And we constantly find that, the sweet spot in Connecticut is around 150 units on multifamily. Anytime you drop below 150 units, it gets harder and harder to actually figure out the finances of, and making them work and look good. The higher the units get, the easier it becomes. When you cross over 200 units, it becomes much more financially feasible. But I recognize Deep River is not the place for 200 units. So then it's kind of how do we figure out the way of doing 20 units or 40 units or even 10 units.
Is there a lot of validity on these small rural areas if for a project to include office space as well, like to expand office space? Because you talk about jobs. I mean, yeah, we can add 40 units here, but if there's no increase in employers, existing employers, if they're not looking for jobs in the area, we're building it, but they still may not come, or it's going to be, had an adverse effect on a lot of prices in the town.
Yeah.
I mean, should towns look to also expand job opportunities in the same, if possible, in the same project?
Yeah, I'm always cautiously favorable to mixed use, especially in smaller towns. My general feeling is, though, be very conservative as to your expectations on the commercial component of mixed use. I've seen so many towns write regulations that say, like, square footage of commercial space has to be equal to that of residential space because they don't want the residential units, they want the commercial. That Weathersfield development that I was talking about, I think it was 300 apartment units with 20,000 square feet of commercial space. The fact is, office is weak right now, retail is weak right now. There's challenges with them, but in a small town, there's always the opportunity for that daycare center or that dentist office or the local attorney. So, a small, 12 unit multifamily development with 4,000 or 6,000 square feet of office space aimed at, the local guy putting out a shingle on Main Street. I think there's a time and place for it. I would just be, not be over ambitious on the commercial aspects, but it can be viable.
One of our recent successes was converting mixed use office and residential back to residential. Or wait, it was all office condominiums to half residential because the
Right.
demand wasn't there to fill all the office. And it was very successful and it's affordable housing as well, so that was
That's
the
great.
town benefited from that.
And I mean, I think that just comes back to the idea of being adaptable. When the market crashed in 2008, from 2008 on to like 2011, I can't tell you how many developers I helped get age restrictions removed, from their developments, or a single family cluster converted into a duplex cluster and so forth, because it was just the nature of the beast in 2010. Those things weren't flying and you have to adapt. And, big piece of advice I can give to all of you is just be adaptable. These things, if it's not built yet, or even if it is built, it's not carved in stone. And if you can adapt and have it perform better, try and find a way to adapt.
Thank you.
Folks, I'm aware of the time. Just wanted to check if people can hang in after 3:30, which is our normal stop time, because we have a great opportunity with Don here. So if there are more questions, I'd love to be able to have those aired out. But if people need to move on, then we should probably move the agenda. Could I just get a quick indication if people are willing to stay a little bit longer? I can't see it. Does anybody have the full Hollywood Squares thing up? Because I only see a few people at the top of my screen.
I do. I see people raising their hands.
It's
Okay.
looking good.
Okay.
Don, you're riveting.
Thank you, Don. Is it okay with you, Don?
What's that?
Is it okay with you to hang in for a few more questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
And now there's silence.
This is Bill. So in Westbrook, you had 21% seasonal and a lower median income, and you've said it's maybe retired people. Is that backed up by data? Like, so we have a restriction on conversion. So the ones that are, one season are somewhat restricted to convert. There's been a lot converted, but so
Yeah.
do we know that the median is lower because those people are there and retired, or is it just a question?
Yeah, I'm kind of speculating, but recognizing that there was a higher median age in Westbrook than the other communities, and actually in all those coastal communities, that we were seeing higher median ages. It just led to kind of a speculation that there is the potential for a second home to a seasonal to convert. Now, I would also just kind of caution in the area of, you may have seasonal beach community properties that are seasonal and can't be converted, but some of those seasonal counted by the census could be in your regular neighborhoods. It's just a second home for someone and it doesn't have such restrictions on it. So there could be multiple things. I'm kind of speculating a little bit there. So I would also say the chance of just retirees wanting to buy into your community. So sell your house in Avon and buy a house in Westbrook and do retirement there. So.
Any other questions for Don?
I went beyond my quota, but I'll just ask one more. You
There's
had
no quota.
you had a graphic showing by cell phone locations and employers.
Yeah.
And when we're trying to figure out what we think we need in this town, I think it's really it may say the population grew by 10. Well, we don't know whether 50 people left and 60 came in, or whether it was 3 out and 13 in. Is how easy is it for towns to get that information? Do I have to hire you?
Yeah, I mean, we pay a ton of money for the software to actually do this. So I would have to assume that most towns would not want to put that number into their budget. But yeah, we can do geofencing analysis by contract for communities. The accuracy, there are statistical calculations that go into it. For a population count, to some extent, I would trust the census more than a geofence. But I've had opportunities I was dealing with a membership institution that we actually had visitor logs for. And over the course of the year, this institution had 106,000 visitors. And we dropped a geofence on it to see. We just wanted to see how accurate is this stuff. And our geofence was like 103,000. So it's close. It's really close. But so it would depend on the data source that you're looking at. Just another example I just want to give you with it is I did a parking study for a developer in West Hartford Center, and we geofenced the center to look at times of day that were busiest. We counted all the parking spaces and then counted all the visits and kind of compared when peak times would be, where parking would be. And one of the things that shocked me the most on that data was in a place like West Hartford Center, where you think of it's a place you go to, you have dinner, you spend time in, you walk around. The most common visitor to West Hartford Center was less than 15 minutes. And that was the Starbucks, that was the CVS pharmacy, that was the dry cleaners, all those things. My point being is the geofence allowed us to see how important that on-street parking is that churns over. So just kind of little sales pitch here. We can do some really interesting things with geofences to kind of look at how a place is functioning, especially if you're talking about a town center or something. There's a lot of interesting data we can pull.
Thank you.
Hey, Merrick. Oh, not hearing you. You're not muted, but your microphone's not muted. Check that second mute.
No, Merrick, we heard you say your name, right? And then you went away.
Still not hearing.
Sort of.
You're very quiet.
That's worse.
Do you want to type it in the chat?
There we go.
I'm gonna ask him to mime.
Don't do charades
sign.
with me. I'll never guess what he's asking. I love viral meetings. Virtual meetings, not viral. Feel like we need Jeopardy music. Tax abatements. Do you have tips for towns when they are looking at tax abatements for multifamily and not sell the farm? Yeah, to be honest with you, and this isn't a plug for the work we do, but really just an honest answer. The thing I like best is when we're hired to do third-party reviews. So West Hartford had never given a tax abatement for anything, commercial or residential. And then a developer came along with the proposal to what became One Park, the proposal to convert an old convent into housing. And it was a complex development. It had historic preservation components, an old chapel that was going to remain amenity space and not return rent. And the developer got their land use approvals from the town and then realized the finances weren't working. And they went back to the town and said, we need a tax abatement. And the town's first reaction was like, no way, not happening. And they were like, well, then we can't do this. The deal's done. It's dead. And so basically, Doman York was retained by the town. The developer paid the bill. They put money into escrow, and the town contracted with us. And then basically we acted as a third-party reviewer, and we asked for the developer's financials so we could see all their numbers. We compared those numbers to our numbers. If we were doing, if we were gonna do the pro forma on the development, what's the numbers we would come up with? We compare them and test them to make sure they make sense. And then we run the numbers on the tax abatement. What makes more sense? A large, 100% over 4 years on the front end, or something that's 50% over per year over 10 years. We played it against kind of the fiscal impact, and we figured out what was the best structure for that deal. And ultimately, we then held the town's hand through the public hearing process, and it was approved, the first abatement ever. So my point being is going out and getting a third party to help, I think is extremely important, because I just know at the end of the day, most municipalities, and even if you have good finance people, they don't always know real estate finance and the complexities of equity stacks and so forth and how these things play out. So, retaining third party, I think, is the best route to go. Thanks. Shall we call it quits, Michael?
You see any other hands up, Eliza?
Eliza had to step away for a sec, but I do not see any other hands.
You don't see any? Good enough then. I think so then, Don. And again, thank you so much for another session that's going to cause us to go back and rethink things.
I'm always glad to help out, so feel free. I'm always welcome to do speeches to you guys. So thanks.
Be careful what you offer, Don.
All right. Have a great day, you guys.
You too, Don.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you, Megan and Eliza, for arranging that. That was I have some notes. I know I'm going to have more questions after I think about it for a while longer, but we know where to find Don, apparently. So that's good. Okay, moving along on the agenda, we have some quick bookkeeping to do. Next up is approval of the minutes from the July 23rd meeting. I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes for discussion purposes. Tom, thank you. Second. I can't see hands raised, but Megan, if you could, or if Eliza's back, you could do that.
Yeah,
For some
David
reason-
Long
Second.
seconded.
Okay. So you recorded the motion in a second, Eliza? Okay. Any discussion, corrections, additions to the minutes? Hearing none, we can move the question. All in favor of approving the minutes of July 23rd, 2024, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Okay, passed unanimously. Okay, next up then, we're going to revisit the process for the regional housing needs assessment. And Megan has sort of a checkpoint for us and a look forward. So I guess would it be fair to combine these last two agenda items and just pass you the baton, Megan?
Sure, sounds great.
Okay.
So I'm not going to go through everything for where we're at on the regional housing needs assessment, but as Michael said, I want to provide a quick update on where we are. I want you to know that we are furiously working behind the scenes at RiverCog to get things ready for our September workshop. So let me see. I'm just going to share my screen here. And you will receive this with plenty of time before our next meeting. It's still a work in progress right now. I'm also going to be transitioning it into a PowerPoint that we can walk through and ask questions and discuss as we go. But this is sort of the early draft report of where we're at, keeping to all of the pretty colors that we're used to seeing from the previous presentations, looking at where we started, looking at getting to future need by current need plus growth, what those mean, and kind of fleshing out how we came to our initial formula. From there, we compare that to our workshop 2. Here's the image from the board that we put together. Transitioned into, these are just the Post-its that are on this board, put into more legible format. And we broke them out here for each card on the board. We listed out the Post-its and responded to them based on the data that we're using. And we have an explanation of the reasons why we chose each of the data points that we did. So that goes through here, the responses to all of the Post-its. And then the good stuff, here's the baseline data. And we just started plugging things in. So baseline data on the side, we plug it into this formula. We did 3 different scenarios based on both our regional housing plan and conversations with Don. We've been in touch with him prior to this meeting and ran a few scenarios by him for what seemed reasonable as far as population projections, given that there's not an agreed upon population projection for the state. So we plugged in population shrinks by 1%, population grows by 1%, population grows by 2.5% as being our high estimate. And you get a sneak preview of the total number of needed units coming out of this. Again, based on prior conversations with Don, we had a little preview that seasonal units would probably be a big deal. So we said, what would happen if we removed seasonal units from the existing supply before running the equation? And you see what that does to the numbers on this side, almost doubles them. We also tried, all right, that seems excessive. Maybe if we apply a proportion to the future projected units. So currently, seasonal units are 7% of the housing supply. We apply 7% to the future growth, add that into the model, looking at numbers like this. Conclusions are still blank. It's something that we're currently working on, and we will be, again, running through the same format for allocation, which is what we're working on now. What we're thinking for September, like I said, you'll have this in advance to formulate some questions. We'll do it as a presentation. We'll do kind of a guided discussion. And then talking with Michael, we're thinking that we're probably going to need to open up some time after we ruminate in September. We'll come back and do some more, iterative processes and come back in October and November to address questions and comments, and then hopefully be able to have a full report for you by December when we would have our final workshop and cookies. So that's the update.
Questions,
Great. It's a lot of
comments?
work.
Concern.
Thank you. It's a lot of work.
It's work, but it's fun. I'm fortunate that I enjoy it. I appreciate that.
And some good news, that represents a significantly less amount of pre-reading for the next workshop than we had for the last workshop. thanks to all the hard work you guys are doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we're looking in really good shape. You know, and like you said, Don has been gracious enough to offer his reviewing time as well to go through some of our ideas and calculations and things that make sense or don't make sense. So he's a good friend of the COG, and we're lucky to have him working with us.
Okay. I think that brings us to the end of the agenda. So anything else, Megan, Eliza?
The housing forum, CCAPA, September 11th. If you have not registered, Ben and I will be on a panel together. We're the last session of the day. If you want to come hear us, I will be talking about all of you and the work that we're doing here. So it'd be nice to see some friendly faces.
Particularly if you have the last session of the day when everybody's drifting out, we should really show up to support you.
Right. Make sure we don't speak to an empty room.
Exactly. Been there.
So Megan, did you send out the link to that? I know I must have missed it. Okay. Could you send it again?
Yeah, Eliza, I think it went out with the last agenda, right?
It did. Yep. I actually sent it in a separate email because I forgot
Separate.
to send it in that email. So,
I'll look for it. Thank you.
okay. If anyone needs it again, and Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is like geared towards commission members, municipal
Yes,
commission members,
correct,
right? So, you know, feel
correct.
free to share if that's appropriate.
Yeah, I saw a breakdown of turnout across the state, and our region is not that well represented yet. So hopefully we can turn that around.
Finish strong.
Yeah.
I think we have 2 in Essex, so we'll be
Awesome.
there.
Thank you.
Okay, then if there's nothing else, is there a motion to adjourn?
So
Want to stay?
moved.
Okay. Thanks, Pat. Second?
Second.
Thank you, David. All in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Bye.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy this great late summer we're having.
When's our next meeting? What day?
It'll be the fourth Thursday of September, or
It's the 24th.
fourth Tuesday.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks. I'm sure I have
Yeah.
it, but I just want to make sure.
And that
thank
one
you.
will be in person.
24th.
Oh,
It'll be a workshop.
yep.
And the COG meeting the next morning will be in person, David, so you can just sleep over at the office.
Will there be snacks?
Absolutely, there will be snacks.
Okay, then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yep. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.